Jeff, travel ban take one was tied up in the courts, blocked by a federal judge who said it was unconstitutional. Does the president have a stronger legal case here with travel ban number two?
He does have a stronger legal case. I don't know if he'll win, but he certainly has improved some of the problems that the court saw. First of all, it's clear that green card holders and people with valid visas are not covered by this executive order. Also, it appears they have removed the religious preference for religious minorities, that is, Christians, that made this look like a Muslim ban. And also, in defining the scope of the problem, they are defining it in terms of the absence of government controls in the 6 named countries, not the religious nature of those countries. So I think when you combine all those things together, it makes for a more defensible package. Now, the problem they still have, which the ACLU and the attorneys general who have challenged it will still raise, is that President Trump said he wanted a Muslim ban, and this is just a Muslim ban with some pretextual explanations. That's where we are right now, but certainly the Trump administration has helped their legal case by watering this down.
And to the point you just made, I'm not a lawyer, so please laugh at me if this is silly, but listening to Secretary Tillerson, then the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and then Secretary Kelly at Homeland Security make a public case, brief in all cases, but to make their public case about how they viewed this policy, why they needed this policy. See, it seemed to me that they were trying to create a record for the court essentially to rebut. This is no longer about candidate Trump. This is about President Trump and these members of his cabinet.
Oh, well, I think that's part of the story. And just the governmental justification for the order is a very important part of why of how this will unfold in the courts. Remember, the first executive order seemingly came out of nowhere with no justification, no explanation. And, you know, again, atmospherics do matter, though they do not have technical legal significance. This will be much more associated with the cabinet members rather than the president announcing it, and that is all helpful in the atmospherics of the legal case.
And Jeff, before I let you go, during our conversation, the New York State Attorney General, a Democrat who has been a Trump critic, released a statement saying his office is now going to review this new order, look at the details, but that he, quote, stands ready to litigate. I assume by the time you get to have lunch today, someone's going to be in court challenging this.
I think that is as safe an assumption as you can make anywhere.
Jeff Toobin, our senior legal analyst, thanks so much. We'll come back to you as developments warrant throughout the hour. Let's come into the room here. Politically, this is very important for the administration, but clearly, one interpretation of this is this was a signature issue in the Trump campaign where he initially called it a Muslim ban. It was one of his early actions as president, and a court stopped him and blocked him. This is a much softer travel ban. Number one, 6 countries instead of 7 majority Muslim countries. Number 2, Syrian refugees are not barred. They, like others on this, are subject to a 120-day pause. So it is certainly softer. The question is, Jeff just dealt with the legal issues. What about the political debate? President on better, stronger ground now?
I think he has probably not picked up in terms of like Capitol Hill any support. Even as the members of the Trump cabinet were speaking, Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader of the Senate, issued a statement saying that a ban is still a ban, that this is mean-spirited and un-American, that it makes us less safe, not more. I don't know that they're going to pick up any support from people who had already been criticizing this whole approach.
From the Democrats. But on this issue, Republicans largely with him. They were very critical of the sloppy rollout of the first one. They were very angered that they were not consulted the first time around. But in terms of the general policy being tougher against the threat of terrorism, he has much more Republicans standing now, right?
I think so. And he had the blueprint, right, from the court order, or the court stay on his original order that was blocked. So he knew what to do, and the folks in his cabinet knew what to do. So their focus now is on this idea that these countries are in some ways not exactly lawless, but they don't have the proper documentation. So I think it'll be much easier for Republicans to rally behind this, and obviously seeing his cabinet officials there giving it a more palatable palatable framework, and also I think it's going to have, as Jeffrey Toobin said, a more easy legal argument. Also, I think the whole idea, though, that this was urgent, that you had to do this because there were terrorists pouring over the border or coming over in airplanes, that seems to have disappeared, and you wonder if that comes back. There still doesn't seem to be a
and
good
this
reason
order,
for it.
we should note to that point, this order doesn't take effect until March 16th.
Right.
So that this is not something that takes effect like that. And as we're having the conversation on this fast-breaking story, the House Democratic leader, to your point, Karen, Nancy Pelosi, issuing a statement saying Take Two changes nothing in her view. She still calls it immoral and unconstitutional. So we know the Democrats politically will argue against it. We know legally we're going to end up back in courts. To the point, though, about the first rollout, remember, I was going to call him General. Secretary John Kelly, now former general at the Department of Homeland Security, he has publicly taken the hit. He has said, this is my department. I take responsibility for this. But we know from our reporting, he and other cabinet secretaries were largely blindsided. When the first travel ban came out, it was orchestrated by the senior staff at the White House level. But listen to Secretary Kelly today making the case, no one should be surprised this time because we're going to do this in a careful, calculated way.
As previously mentioned, I have spent much of the day today on the phone with members of Congress, the leadership, explaining the ins and outs of this EO, and I did the same thing last week. So there should be no surprises, whether it's in the media or on Capitol Hill. Thanks very much, and thanks for your time.
Or in his own office, at his department, is a point I wanted to make there, because they were not happy the first time.
They weren't. And actually, when Kelly went out afterwards, remember he had the press conference to explain what happened. That's when members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, felt a little bit better. They believed that Kelly had it under control. At least they could staunch the bleeding just a little bit. So that was interesting, just to have the cabinet secretaries being the public face of this. Probably a lot better politically for their own party to have them selling this, explaining it, look like they're thinking through it, rather than having the president himself, who's known to shoot from the hip, to discuss this. The question is, what does the Republican leadership do? We know that Paul Ryan in the past criticized the rollout, but he didn't necessarily criticize the policy. But what about some of those other people who have been longtime critics of the Trump administration, the Lindsey Grahams of the world? Where do they come down? Do they call this tantamount to a Muslim ban, the way the Democrats are? I tend to agree with Karen. I think that you will probably have some of those critics still be critics in the Republican ranks.
But it is interesting to watch because, again, and the president said he thought this was handled fine. That's what he said publicly. Everybody around the president acknowledges this was not handled very well, and that's one of the reasons it was tied
and the
up,
Attorney
blocked in
General,
the courts.
by the way, in that statement was continuing to assert that the original travel ban was perfectly legal.
Right, and yet we expect now legal they will drop that fight and say that that fight is now moot because they have travel ban number 2, which are the Attorney General out there saying this is legal, I will fight for it. You had the Secretary of Homeland Security saying essentially, sorry, this time we're going to brief you, we're going to take our time, it's not implemented till March 16th, this is going to be done in a careful way. And we know not only has there been a debate here at home, but around the world, many U.S. allies have criticized this, saying they believe the president is doing something that's not good for the fight against terrorism. So the Secretary of State was part of the rollout this time, and here was his message to our allies around the world.
To our allies and partners around the world, please understand this order is part of our ongoing efforts to eliminate vulnerabilities that radical Islamist terrorists can and will exploit for destructive ends.
Radical Islamist, not radical Islamic, as the president likes to say.
I mean, this is so different in, in completely how it was rolled out. But I think the biggest difference, the president has an attorney general now. That was one of the biggest problems on the first Friday when he signed that at the Pentagon. He didn't have his Justice Department in place. It was so rushed into business here. So this is how it should be done. So I think Republicans will respond to this much better. It's softer. It is going to be challenged, of course, but just the fact that he actually has an attorney general standing up there and he can defend it, that's a huge difference. But look how the president signed this. In fact, we can't look at it because the media was not allowed in the Oval Office. This is a president in the first 6 weeks or so who seems to me to love signing executive orders. He holds them up. He has news conferences around them. It was signed in secret this morning, and I think that's very revealing as well.
And there were no questions taken at the announcement either.
Right, no questions, which gets us to the thing we're going to talk about in a minute. So I don't want to dwell on it for more than a couple seconds here. So we're going to take a break and talk about it more in a minute. But that is a reflection. This is a signature issue of this president.